First, thank you to Wellcome for inviting me, and also for Stephen. I think it's really interesting from the perspective as an artist, kind of back to back with the scientist. It's not only a talk about consciousness, it's also a study into kind of like how arts and sciences approach very similar topics, but in very different ways. And on that note, I was interested when. How are we doing on? There we go. So I'm taking the title from, actually it was the title of the talk, as Does Our Identity and Self-Awareness Rely on Stories in Time and Space to be Stable? And when Stephen asked me to participate, the first thing that struck me was a project that I'd been working on actually at that time, which was a project called 7 days. And 7 days was a long durational work. I lived without sight for 7 days and nights in the studio, and by sense of touch alone, I was able to feed and take care of myself for 168 hours. So I set up in my studio environment a kind of sensory deprivation experience, and the idea of this for me was, I called it going under, and the idea of going without images obviously interests me, and I'd read of yogis spending years in complete darkness and psychologists running light deprivation studies, but I think the most pertinent thing for me was what landscapes are available to the artist when they're only given an internal view for 7 days. And with that as a sort of brief, I'm going to go through my slides, and I will talk about what happens when you do something like that, and then I'll talk about why you would want to do something like that. So I don't want to get into why just yet. I think it's kind of quite interesting. I'm this experiment. So here, this is a blackout blindfold, and it creates, you can keep your eyes open and you can look directly into sunlight, and there's no stimulus hitting the eyeball whatsoever. So you're in complete darkness, so you're blind for that amount of time. So you start off with itself, and then it kind of, so the thing that gets interesting for me is that what happens, it felt like 3 things, and it happened over about 3 or 4 days. On the first day, your skin body begins to disappear in quite an interesting way, as in the bridge of your nose and your hands it's data that just reaffirms you, the you-ness. I can see me, here I am, here is, and we all have, weirdly, this triangle here just pretty much follows us everywhere. And if you remove that, there's kind of this odd sensation that even on day 1, where you're kind of, you're only firing on 4 other sense gates, so you're kind of looking for some other stuff. And what happens once you move the skin body, I end up on day 2 relying a lot more on the sound body. And what's interesting about using the sound body is that it doesn't have such a clear distinction between internal and external, as in the sounds will happen within me and without me. So that solidness of you begins to get a bit spacious. And the other sense gate that seems to be very prevalent at that point is also the sense of touch if you're moving. So you do have a sense of your body, but if you're sat still, is there something? Yeah. If you're sat still for a prolonged amount of time, whole limbs begin to sort of disappear. And then the final thing that happens in usually about day 3 or day 4, what happened was time begins to disappear. So this is me sleeping in the studio. So serotonin is the serotonin and melatonin regulate your sleep basically. And if you're not having daylight hitting your eyeball and triggering the release and the creation of serotonin, your melatonin goes into overdrive. And if your melatonin goes into overdrive, you kind of day and night sort of go out the window, and your sense of time. I could regulate time by the buses outside my studio, but beyond that, I could be up at 4 in the morning wanting breakfast or lunch, or I could be in the evening and thinking it's morning. So you just don't have that spatial awareness. So that all sounds kind of I don't know what. So in the context of this particular talk, why I was interested in that was how can you create out of this space where you've really reduced the level of stimulus, and what kind of work can you create? And I think at this point, when you're doing that level of deprivation, you kind of most probably need to introduce some sort of structure. Because of my art practices around language and narrative, I basically began to write. So I was doing automatic writing, and I was repeating the same phrase again and again. And the other thing that I was doing is mindfulness practice, which is very good for cutting through ruminative thought. Ruminative thought seems to kind of go into overdrive because there's something about identity needing to hold on to a sense of self, and that sense of self usually, once it doesn't have the sense gates, it usually begins to just ruminate. So the mindfulness and the writing strategies were how I was exploring or giving myself some sort of scaffolding. Right, so I'm going to show you the work. The next set of images are taken with the help of my friend Andy Saul, who's a photographer, and it documents the process, the journey of basically, so this is me setting up the studio. And then I've given myself, my one raft or my one piece of scaffolding is this phrase here, which is a kind of manifesto. It's my fate only to write one story. Again and again I place the words down until I reach the end of the page. I tell myself if I can describe things well enough, place words accurately enough, or say things succinctly enough, finally I will arrive at the truth. And this is the myth that I live by, that from a story I can describe the world as if it makes sense. Here I am, an author to nothing, sunlight watches over my shoulder. So when we're losing light, this is dusk setting in, not there in this particular one. So after the 7 days, this is the image of 7 days of just basically using language as a raft in which to kind of sort of go through this very, very spacious and quite expansive environment. And that was the first project it was the first drawing that I had created in this series. And what interested me, so you can see, so there's a camera up here documenting that, and I'm just living in the floor there, and that's me at the end of it. And then taking the goggles off and then having this experience of readjusting back into this very sensual world, which I'll describe afterwards. But one of the things that was interesting for me was that when I look at that image, I understand it to be a very unconscious image. It's coming from a very kind of like not unconscious space, but it's coming out of a very mixed space. It's not having aesthetic decisions into how it looks or how it responds. So the first thing I was interested in is giving myself the same parameters but with sight. So I redrew exactly the same drawing for another 7 days but with sight, making aesthetic decisions on how it should look. So I was repeating the same phrase, doing the same drawing, creating this body of work here. So this drawing is exactly the same content, but just done through a mind state, which is a lot more like, okay, I'm going to make some aesthetic decisions on how it looks. Now, for me, I didn't mind the second drawing in the series, but it didn't have the resonance of the first drawing because the first one had a good relationship, I felt, towards the unconscious space. So once I had finished this, I returned to the studio finally, and I erased the same piece of work. So this is, again, another series of photos documenting the erasure of this work. So going back to Stephen's question, does your identity and self-awareness rely on stories in time and space to be stable? I would say in my experience of making art in such a manner, yes, it tells us that language is a foundational raft, an essential tool by which we construct both a linear narrative through time and also a means by which we can fashion out identities. There's a quote by Muriel Roixer, and her quote is, "The universe is made of stories, not of atoms," which I think has some sort of resonance in this. And there's also, I feel like, so for those two pieces, I very much feel 7 Days in Darkness was a struggle from the creation within a seemingly endless void. So the first one was in darkness and I was in a void space trying to create. And then the second piece, 7 Days Void, was the process reversed. So it was about how to take something already existing and return it to a space of not knowing or erasure. So both works, one is, for me, when I look at the first piece, I'm very much in this awareness that I can say I drew it, but I don't know what parts of me did that drawing. And when I look at the second piece, you know that there's a history of erasure, and then the viewer doesn't have the viewer has a history with the relationship to the drawing rather than the original drawing, which is now gone. And then the only other comment or point I would like to make is kind of like, I must admit to many people still living in this way might sound slightly ridiculous, but my question to that is, has modernity or where we are right now come close to helping us cope with the current epidemic of overstimulation? By removing just one sense, it began to reveal how much I neglected my everyday awareness. After a week living blind in the studio, walking home through the streets of Hackney, my acute senses only heightened the realization of how desensitized I have to become to traverse the city in a normal manner. I found that on returning into the world of the five senses, a lot of my fear of going into the dark and into a space where I'm deprived of sense is actually a fear of meeting a long-running neglect to stillness and sensitivity. So at the end of the experience of doing both of those projects, it was amazing how much you appreciate all of your senses, and it's amazing the gap that there is between the everyday modus operandi that we operate in and actually what's happening within, our being. So I think, and I think that's it for. Was I too quick or?
Perfect, Sam. You are perfect. A round of applause for Sam. Thank you so much. Very generous to share your work with us. Any questions for Sam?
Hello, I thought that was really interesting. Did you find over the 7-day period that your visual memory changed at all? Did you start off by seeing normal pictures that you would see if you had sight, and then over the 7 days?
It's quite interesting. Like when you say visual memory, I don't really. I know that I started lucid dreaming. So normally the narratives that happen in your dreamscape when you're fully asleep, when you wake up, that narrative stops. But if you're not turning on your movement body and you're not turning on your sound body, your mind will happily carry on having a dreamscape. So it's kind of interesting that you're navigating quite a broad scope of your unconscious when you're in that space. What happened to sight? I don't know. It just felt like it's like, how do you describe sight when you're asleep? It's kind of, I don't know even know whether you could call that sight. It feels like a free association of maybe they're images, maybe they're thoughts. It's this kind of grey one. Sorry, yeah.
Thank you. Hello, sir. Thank you.
Hi, it's sort of a cliche, isn't it, that if you're blind, that then your other senses are going to increase in acuity. Did you feel that?
Yeah, I think you've got your other senses increasing. I think the thing that was most interesting for me was my sense of identity and how it related to my senses. So the senses do get acute, but your sense of identity really clings to stuff, as in like, it needs a certain amount of food. If you starve it of certain things, it'll go into quite a fictitious state. And I think what I'm trying to suggest in the talk possibly is that language is one of the things that we use to structure. So how we're corresponding now, and the use of language is giving a format by sharing stuff. But really what's kind of, on a neurological level, who knows what's happening in there and here? It's kind of like a completely different kettle of fish.
Were you alone during that time? Or?
I had people drop off food, and that was insanely intimate. As in, it was kind of, for them it wasn't intense, and that's what I mean when you left the space, you were like, wow, this is, like, you're looking at the phenomena of looking. You're not looking at content, you're just looking at what it's like to look, and everything is so acutely aware. So when people walk into the space, they're like, oh God, I'm stressed, and what day, it's been like this, and you're like, wow, you're in my head, really, because a lot of the senses that are happening in here aren't really triggering. I think the biggest shock initially was the loss of the skin body. I disappeared, you know. I had to rely on the sound body, and that's a very different sense of identity.
Last question.
Thanks very much for your talk. I was just wondering about the interesting relationship between language and sight specifically as the sense that you chose, and especially written language. And I think it's interesting that right now in this beautiful center there's an exhibition on the voice as well as on state of consciousness. And in the voice exhibition they're talking about how there's a theory that language was developed not to transfer information but rather as a way of sort of communion or song, which I find really interesting because you were saying that sort of language is a raft with which we craft internal narrative. So I guess I wonder, what do you think about people that don't use language either who are mute or people pre sort of language and the way that they would have conceived of reality and whether it would have been as sight reliant, I guess.
Yeah. I think language is like most of words and that whole world is a shoreline, and there's different degrees. My use of language in that particular one, it became very energetic. So the tonality and the intention of a sentence became so intimately familiar that I would feel exhausted writing the fourth sentence. But by the time I got to the fifth sentence, it felt like I was going downhill. And I wasn't in the meaning of the words anymore. I was in much more of an energetic relationship with writing, as in my tone has a relationship here, that if I just got stuck on my tone has a relationship here, my tone. And once it goes into a tonality, it's moved out of maybe a certain cognitive space and it's moved into another. You know, as a dyslexic, I learned to learn the alphabet by a song. Da, 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 da. So, and I know that people teach learning the alphabet to highly dyslexic children by getting it to be sculpted in clay, the letter A. So you're just using different sense gates to translate forms that don't particularly make much sense. So I don't think language is a solid thing. I think it's much more either a shoreline or it smudges into form a lot easier than we like to think.
Perfect. A round of applause for Simon.